Greetings. This is reading 12 of Anatoly Fomenko's History, Fiction, or Science. Last time, we started in Chapter 2, Astronomical Dating, and Fomenko spent a good deal of time discussing this parameter D theory and issue. Originally published in a paper a few decades ago, which is one of the things that got him thinking about all of this. It was published by a NASA astronomer by the name of Robert Newton. And from what I gathered, and I'm not an astronomer, I'm not a mathematician, and we all know that I'm not a professional expert in any of these things, and most of the people listening to this probably aren't either. That doesn't mean that we cannot grasp what is being told us, as long as it's being told us in a coherent way, and that these people are not using insider lingo, and they often do that because many of these pseudo-sciences, pseudo-medicine, pseudo-academic intellectualism is designed to create a great rift between the priesthood, which are all really just the shoeshine boys of the ruling elite, and the proletariat, who are very intelligent, who are hardworking, who oftentimes find little time, and what little time we find, we oftentimes waste with just entertainment or menial repetitive activities to somehow soothe our minds and bodies from the stresses of a life that has far too many burdens in it for a man or woman to handle. But for my part, I found it very interesting. I wasn't surprised at all that a NASA astronomer would come up with such a fantastical theory to try to, I don't know, sweep under the rug the problems that we now see in chronology. I wasn't surprised at all of the so-called academics, intellectuals, scientists, etc., over the years, for centuries, that have rallied around the Scaliger-Petavius chronology. It was not a surprise whatsoever. Something that did shock me, and it was the one thing that made me wish that I had a better handle on astronomy. And I do honestly wish, especially in these portions of the book, that AJC 1844 were listening and would comment on the astronomy portions of this. Now, I know that these theories, phantom time, completely upsets and in some ways obliterates the assumptions of historicist eschatology. Because historicist eschatology relies on a certain kind of model for dating, a certain kind of model for who you perceive as who over the course of the prophetic time period being described in Revelation and other eschatological books and passages of both the New and Old Testaments. But still, AJC 1844 knows a good deal about astronomy. Now, any of you out there who do know a good deal about astronomy, please comment. Help us clarify these things. Now, in the last section, I read how Fomenko had assessed a writing that nobody can prove the origin of or the date of. It was supposed to be a journal by a Greek named Thucydides. And Thucydides described these 3 eclipses. And these eclipses were supposed to have happened around a certain time during the Peloponnesian War. And what Fomenko did was he took the descriptions of these eclipses in Greek, which then he had the Greek gone over by another academic, an expert in Greek, to make sure it was saying what he thought it said. And he took that information and figured out what sort of triple eclipse, 2 solar and 1 lunar, what sorts they would have to be, and when 3 eclipses like that could occur in the time frames described. And when he did all of this, the eclipses that he found that would have been the most likely candidates would have had to have occurred, as he said. This is his theory. I'm not saying it's mine, because I'm just barely hanging on to completely understand all of this. But anyways, it is his theory that these 3 eclipses, as they are described, could not have happened except in around the 10th to 12th century, or 9th to 11th centuries, AD. So that's kind of the gist of what was discussed in sections 1 through 3 of chapter 2. Now I pick up with section 4. Astronomy moves the ancient horoscopes into the Middle Ages. 4.1 The Medieval Astronomy. The naked eye can see 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Their visible movement trajectories are adjacent to the solar ecliptic, or the line of its annual movement. The very word planet means wandering star in Greek. Go figure. Unlike stellar motion, the movement of the planets is relatively fast. Their movement on the, quote, sphere of immobile stars, unquote, is characterized by significant irregularities that can be explained by the fact that the planet trajectory is observed from the Earth is a result of the projection of the telluric orbit onto the immobile celestial sphere through the moving planet. Most of the time, the planets are observed from Earth follow the sun in their movement. However, after certain periods of time that differ for various planets, they begin to move in the opposite direction. This is the so-called retrograde movement of the planets. We should note that Mercury and Venus don't go far from the Sun in their movement as observed from the Earth. Other planets can get far away from the Sun since their orbits are located beyond the telluric orbit, unlike those of Venus and Mercury. Complex and seemingly chaotic movement of the planets give birth to the belief, back in the days of yore, that there is a feedback between planets and human lives. Objectively, this belief was based on the undeniable correlation between the change of seasons and the position of celestial objects. This is how astrology was born, a science of planets, stars, and the effect they have on people's lives. A significant part of medieval literature contains astrological texts, especially astronomical tractates up until Kepler's age and even after that. The existence of several competing astrological schools led to the use of lavish symbolism by medieval astrologers, which makes it hard to speak of unified astrological definitions. Furthermore, each school developed its own linguistic and symbolic system. However, we shall soon see that many countries have surprisingly enough used a more or less uniform astrological symbolic system. For zodiacal it just sounds wrong saying zodiacal. Zodiacal. That sounds better. It feels better. For zodiacal constellations, for example, this can mean that astrology was born relatively recently in the epoch when the means of communication between the astronomers of different countries had already been developed well enough to provide for regular information exchange and a similar astrological language in Europe and in Egypt, for instance. It would be expedient to remind the reader that the modern names for planets have been introduced by astrologers. The names for days of the week in such languages as English, French, and German are also in direct relation to astrological concepts. Planets have roughly the same trajectory on the sky. The circle of their movement along the ecliptic plane is called the zodiac. It is separated into 12 parts or constellations. Astrology was of the opinion that there is a special relation between the planets and each zodiacal constellation. A detailed theory was developed in this respect, wherein each constellation and each planet have been assigned a character. Mars is alleged to be aggressive, Jupiter divine, Saturn deathly, etc. In the so-called 4 books of the medieval astrologers, one may read that Mars scorches and burns. His color is red, the color of fire. Color used to be ascribed to the planets as well. Thus, Mars was considered red, Saturn pale, etc. The combination of planets and constellations was given special attention. For instance, bloodthirsty Mars entering the sign or constellation of Leo was considered an extremely dangerous omen of war and bloodshed. Ill-boding Saturn, the god of death, when entering the sign of Scorpio, was regarded as an omen of epidemics and plague. Saturn and Scorpio were actually considered symbols of death. As we have already mentioned, the projections of planets onto the immobile stellar sphere moves in leaps as the Earth revolves around the Sun. In its movement between the stars from the west to the east, each planet located outside the orbit of Earth slows down at some point, then stops and begins to move in the opposite direction. It stops after that, begins to move back, stops again, and resumes its movement from the west to the east. An elongated loop appears as a result, the projection of the telluric orbit onto the immobile stellar sphere through a planet. These leaps were naturally observed a long time ago and led to the comparison with horses running across the sky. A horoscope is a name used for referring to the disposition of planets in zodiacal constellations. Mars in Virgo, Saturn in Pisces, etc. Horoscopes can be calculated. The question of a planet's location in one constellation or another is a question of its fitting into the sector, about 30 degrees wide. For many problems, the longitudinal precision of 5 degrees is quite sufficient. The latitude of the planet doesn't have to be calculated. Their deviations from the ecliptic are minute from the point of view of fitting into a constellation. This is why the old documents that contain horoscopes usually only give the zodiacal or longitudinal planetary disposition. Horoscopes are calculated in the following way. Having fixed the constellation distribution of planets for a given movement, today, for instance, and knowing the numeric values of the periods of the planet's revolutions around the sun, we can move to the front or to the back using periods divisible by the revolution length and get zodiacal planetary dispositions for the past or the future. Tables of various precision exist nowadays, ones defining the zodiacal positions of planets. Such tables have been compiled by P. Neugebauer, Newcomb, Leverrier, Morozov, and others. Such tables exist to answer the question of what the zodiacal position of a given planet was on a given day in a given year. N.A. Morozov and M.A. Viliev have also compiled reverse tables showing when a given planetary disposition may have really taken place. Relatively recently, a number of good computer applications have appeared that can be used for horoscope calculation. We have employed some of them. Nowadays, we have a rather vague concept of the way of thinking characteristic for medieval astronomers. The astrological hue was dominant in the perception of many medieval scientists, not just astronomers. Medieval books on astronomy are filled with astrological symbolism despite the fact that they describe real celestial events. These books weren't written in a cipher. This was the usual way of writing down celestial observations, understandable for both writers and readers. For instance, dates of death on gravestones and monuments or memorable dates were often written down as horoscopes. In other words, drawn as the zodiacal positions of planets for a given moment in time. Astrology occupied one of the leading positions as a fundamental cosmological discipline. This ideology is largely lost for us nowadays. That is why the understanding of such books requires the knowledge of the symbolism used therein. An ideological overview of medieval astrology is given in reference 849. For instance, Troels Lund, a specialist in history of religion, gives an illuminating description of the medieval Western European scientific Weltanschauung. This is what he writes about planets in particular. Such strange movement could only have been interpreted as a manifestation of will, as proof of independent life. The opaque celestial dome rotates above all of this, and it has stars affixed to it in figures bearing semblance to animals. This was nothing but astronomy transformed into a religion. Thus happened the birth of art and science that would never fail to attract human attention for centuries to come, and considered the crown of human knowledge. For me, I find it very interesting that if you go back a ways, these astronomers very much saw what they were looking at as essentially a dome or some sort of hard, fast boundary rotating overhead, with the planets being wandering stars because of their odd retrograde movements, as though they were in a separate layer, or that there may be a number of translucent layers that make up the heavenly bodies that we see orbiting overhead. The Bible says that Yahweh has made a tabernacle for the sun to dwell in. All items of interest. The book quotes biblical fragments that are astronomical in their nature, according to Truls Lund. We shall get back to this issue soon. The flourishing scientific astrology invariably spawned an offshoot, the so-called applied astrology, or the science of predicting the destinies of people, states, and monarchs by planetary movements or by the stars. Astrology enjoyed state support in medieval Western Europe. Really. Astronomy mixed with astrology was also extensively used by the Roman Church, which employed it for calendarian purposes in particular. Astrology became the leading science of the time, the basis for all other sciences. If we regard the 16th century astrology objectively nowadays, our first reaction will be that of surprise at how great a role the belief in stars and the way they affect one played in that epoch. It had not just been the ignorant masses that believed in astrology. That's us, folks. Even the greatest minds followed suit. The greatest minds. Even the greatest minds. It suffices to, I really have to speak against that. I doubt that. I guess it depends on how you, as an individual, are defining the greatest minds. It suffices to take a look at the great variety of works on astrology that appeared in the 15th and 16th centuries. Just the ones that can be found in the two main Copenhagen libraries would make a rather voluminous pile. Their authors aren't obscure, anonymous scribblers. On the contrary, these books were written by the greatest minds of the time. There is no name in the 16th century Scandinavia that could compare to Tycho Brahe, one of the greatest representatives of natural sciences, a popularizer of Heinrich Rantzau, the viceroy of Schleswig-Holstein. About Tycho Brahe, all of his scientific activity was dedicated to astrology's development to a certain extent. The same can be said about Melanchthon and Kepler in Germany. Astrology flourished at the courts of European monarchs in France, England, and Italy. It is known that Rudolph II, Louis of Savoy, Catherine de' Medici, Charles IX, Henry IV, and other Western European rulers were active proponents of astrology. Melanchthon claimed that the Bible gave direct dictations of the divine origins of astrology. The fact that many fragments of the Bible's prophetic books, for example, are astronomical and contain horoscopes in cipher was considered indisputable in the Middle Ages. It is believed that the authority of astrology had received several mortal blows from Copernicus, Newton, and Laplace. Therefore, the astrological system of many ancient texts lost its importance and mystery, became lackluster, and soon forgotten. Nowadays, the majority of readers will fail to understand it for the most part. The discovery of the chronometer and other instruments rendered quotidian sky observations void of value, which has completely crushed the foundations of astrological ideology. There has been no other epoch when people's direct perception of the sky had been quite as meager. This is in reference to the 14th through 20th century. There is hardly one person in 100 in London, Paris, or Copenhagen that knows whether the moon is full or new today, or what the current location of Ursa Major is. The light of the nocturnal sky has assumed a purely decorative role. And I unfortunately agree. Unlike the spiritual leaders of the Western European countries, the Russian Orthodox Church is considered to have had a very negative attitude towards astrology. A very demonstrative episode occurred in the Kremlin in 1559, when Ivan the Terrible returned the present of a sophisticated clock embellished with moving representations of celestial bodies to the Danish ambassadors, who were told that, quote, the present is of no use for a Christian ruler who believes in God without concerning himself with either planets or celestial symbols. At the same time, astronomy was used in Russia for Pascalian calculations. We shall be relating this in more detail in Chronology 6. Apart from that, we quote some facts in Chronology 6 that shall greatly aid in the explanation of the negative attitude of the Orthodox Church towards astrology that has been prevalent ever since the second half of the 16th century and continues until the present day. Now, I personally, I don't know a lot about Ivan the Terrible, and any of my listeners who are Russian or who have spent a little bit more time on Russian history than I have would know far, far, far more about Ivan the Terrible. But isn't that interesting, his name, Ivan the Terrible? Who gave him that moniker, Ivan the Terrible? I mean, just think about it. When I hear Ivan the Terrible, what do I think? I think of somebody who is terrible, right? When in fact, I don't know, but he may have been a very great king, leader, person. It seems to me that some of the greatest persons of history, at least from the time of Christ, have been smeared endlessly by the most rotten people that exist on the face of this plane. Section 4.2. The method of unprejudiced astronomical dating. As we've already mentioned, the idea of using the horoscopes contained in old documents for the astronomical dating of the events described in the texts originated as early as the 16th century. It has been occasionally used by astronomers and chronologists of more recent epochs. If some document contains a horoscope, then the use of the theoretical calculation tables for reference can allow for the attempt to select a fitting horoscope whose astronomical characteristics would satisfy the description of the old document. A certain date would be the result of these calculations, or a number of dates, in case of several astronomical solutions, which will happen if the description is vague or incomplete. However, the practical use of this apparently simple idea ran into great practical complications, whose reasons were far from astronomical. The culprit was the existing Scaligian chronology. N.A. Morozov had discovered that under the pressure of Scaligerine chronology, the astronomers of the 17th through 19th century had to resort to arbitrary fittings to a greater or lesser extent in order to make the, in quotes, historical tradition that they believed in correspond to the results of their astronomical calculations. The thing is that the astronomers of the 17th through 18th century, in an epoch when Scaligerine chronology had already been shaped. Therefore, the principal historical reigns, wars, characters, etc., were distributed across the time axis by historians for the most part. This is why astronomers had already, in quotes, known the approximate datings of old texts that they needed to date astronomically from historical chronology. The role of astronomers would thus become limited to making marginal corrections of historical datings using the, in quotes, astronomical method. If the astronomers failed to find a precise astronomical solution in the necessary epoch, they preferred to question the old document's exactness and not historical chronology. In such cases, astronomers usually utter something along the lines of, quote, "The scribe must have made a mistake putting Saturn into Pisces, since it has to be in Virgo, so that the events described would fall over the 5th century BC. Correcting Pisces for Virgo, the astronomers ipso facto confirmed the opinion of Scaligerite historians who dated the document to the 5th century BC. N.A. Morozov's great achievement is that he was the first to question the consensual historical chronology, and not the astronomical reports contained in the old documents. He suggested extending the search interval of astronomical solutions so that it would include the entire historical epoch up to the Middle Ages. However, even N.A. Morozov wasn't entirely consistent and usually preferred not to venture further in time than the 6th century A.D. It turned out that the accurate use of the astronomical method reveals dates that are a lot more recent than the ones offered by Scaliger. Furthermore, in some cases, the new dates turn out to pertain to the late Middle Ages. All of this is notwithstanding the fact that the astronomical results obtained by Morozov cannot be regarded as finite, being certain that only the ancient chronology had been incorrect. He was gullible enough to have trusted the medieval chronology beginning with approximately 300 to 500 A.D. This is why he usually failed to research the entire possible time interval, most often contenting himself with attempts at finding the solution in the period between 2000 BC and 600 AD, and only occasionally further into the Middle Ages. Morozov most often did not consider the later epoch between the 14th and 18th century at all. He was of the opinion that the ancient eclipses and horoscopes couldn't possibly have moved forward in time to such an extent that they would end up in the 13th or even 17th century AD. Thus, moving forwards along the time axis in his search of astronomical solutions, he would most probably stop at the first one that fit. This is why we treat his astronomical results as preliminary when we report them. It is possible that if we carry on with his unfinished research, we shall find astronomical solutions that will be a lot more recent and occasionally more precise. However, we can already state the following with certainty. if new and more precise astronomical solutions are really found, this is the case with the Dendera zodiacs and the Apocalypse, see below, then they shall be even closer to us than the ones found by N.A. Morozov, since he had already analyzed the period between the Antiquity and the 6th century A.D. Section 4.3. Many, in quotes, ancient astronomical observations may have been theoretically calculated by late medieval astronomers and then included into the ancient chronicles as real observations. Digest that. One shouldn't forget that in the creation of the, in quotes, correct history according to Scaliger, the chronologers of the 16th through 17th century often turned to astronomers asking them to perform calculations of some sort. We have already mentioned the heavy astrological influence that the medieval science was subject to. The astrological schools of the 15th through 17th century may have occupied themselves with solving such, quote, scientific problems as the planet disposition during the coronation of Justinian I, who lived in the 6th century A.D. according to the erroneous opinion of the medieval chronologers, with astronomical/astrological methods. Another problem they may have been busy with was giving exact datings to the lunar eclipses of the Roman Empire epoch that the medieval chronologers had already erroneously ascribed to the 3rd to 6th century A.D. Yet another one may have been the estimation of the Easter Sunday in the year of the Nicene Council, whose erroneous dating of allegedly the 4th century A.D. was already calculated theoretically a few years earlier, in the 16th through 17th century. All these astronomical calculations, in quotes, were slyly included in the final editions of ancient chronicles. All of this probably happened in the 16th through 17th and even 18th century. It was a great body of work, which would have been useful if the chronology created by the medieval historians had been correct. However, this chronology proved erroneous, and so the medieval astronomers aggravated the mistakes of the historians, calculating planetary dispositions for the 6th century A.D., when Justinian I is supposed to have lived, and entering something like, quote, on the day Justinian I was crowned, the planets were in such and such constellations, into the chronicles. As a result, the chronicles may have been given an erroneous chronological and astronomical skeleton, which was apparently just a result of later medieval calculations represented as true ancient astronomical observations in the chronicles. Afterwards, this partially erroneous and partially falsified material rigidified, gathered some authority dust, and reached us in this exact form. Our contemporaries, both historians and astronomers, read ancient chronicles and rejoice to find astronomical data in them. The alleged observations, fruits of theoretical calculations of the 16th through 18th century, are dated with modern astronomical methods, and everybody is clearly brimming with satisfaction when the results obtained concur with Scaligerian chronology. Thus, the chronology of Scaliger Petavius receives additional, in quotes, proof, which leads to a vicious cycle. Of course, one occasionally finds discrepancies with modern astronomy due to the fact that the astronomical calculation methods of the 16th through 18th century, those dealing with past dates, were imprecise and a lot worse than the ones currently used. Upon locating such discrepancies, modern astronomers patronizingly correct the ancient observer, which creates an even greater illusion of the veracity of Scaligean chronology. What should one do when the results of modern astronomical calculations radically contradict the Scaligean chronology? In such cases, modern historians start talking about, quote, the ignorance of the ancient observers, unquote. Our new results show that medieval chronology can only be trusted from the 16th century on. One needs to perform an even greater body of work in the field of finite independent dating of eclipses and horoscopes present in written sources. According to the latest research, N.A. Morozov's astronomical solutions are often complemented with new, considerably more precise and recent solutions scattered across the interval between the 13th and 16th century. Section 4.4. Which astronomical observations of the ancients might be a result of the late medieval theoretical calculations? Our idea is as follows. The chronologers of the Scaliger-Petavius school first created the erroneous chronology of the ancient and medieval history, having arbitrarily extended the real history of the 11th through 17th century AD into the past. After that, in the 16th through 17th century, a great body of work was started in order to make this scheme, quote, look scientific, unquote, and backed by the authority of astronomical calculations. If we're to call a spade, it was really a deliberate falsification of history. From Anatoly Fomenko. If we are to call a spade, that Scaliger-Petavius chronology and all academics and scientists who have worked to do nothing more than to support the Scaliger-Petavius chronology. In the words of Fomenko, if we're to call a spade, it was really a deliberate falsification of history. Now, it is not often that we get such a deliberately honest assessment of what has happened. It's refreshing. Now, Fomenko continues with point 1. The ancient calendar theories were put forward. The chronologers of the 16th through 17th century began to reconstruct the ancient calendar systems that people had allegedly been using in antediluvian times for hundreds and thousands of years. The initial points of calendars would appear as a result of theoretical calculations, as well as dates of the Genesis, the Great Deluge, etc. The results of these calculations would be written into the ancient chronicles without any hesitation whatsoever in order to help maintain chronological order. What this meant, in fact, was the confirmation of mistakes or blatant falsifications of the Scaliger-Petavius school. Real medieval events assumed wrong datings that proved them a long way into the past. Nowadays, these ancient datings are considered to prove the Scaligerian history by historians who remain unaware of the fact that many of these calendar observations are a result of theoretical calculations of the chronologers of as late an epoch as the 16th through 17th century AD. Yet another vicious cycle. Point 2. Certain horoscopes may have been calculated in reverse. Rough calculations of planetary dispositions may already have been known in the late Middle Ages. The chronicles would then undergo special editing, after which they began to contain such passages as, in the 8th century since the foundation of Rome, on the day Julius Caesar was murdered, the planets occupied the following positions. The planet dispositions would be calculated exactly for the 1st century BC, since the astronomers of the 16th and 17th century already knew, in their blind trust of Scaliger Petavius, that Caesar lived in the 1st century BC. Nowadays, historians believe these astronomical observations to be the real thing, and try to present them as proving the correctness of the Scaligerian chronology, which leads to a vicious cycle. For instance, one of the astronomer-astrologers of the Middle Ages would first calculate that some astronomical event occurred in the 1st century BC. Afterwards, the fact that this dating was calculated would fall into oblivion, and the result of the same medieval calculation would be called proof of the fact that Julius Caesar really lived in the 1st century BC, for instance. Point 3. First and foremost, a number of lunar eclipses were calculated into the past. Let us mention that the lunar eclipse calculations are rather simple. They were successfully performed already in the epoch of the 16th through 17th century. Solar eclipses are a different matter and involve a lot more complex calculation. However, in the 17th century, let alone the 18th century, the astronomers were already capable of counting solar eclipses into the past as well. The calculated lunar and solar eclipses may have been included into the erroneous history of Scaliger and Petavius in the following manner. On the day such and such emperor died, an eclipse occurred. The process was apparently as follows. Having calculated that some eclipse occurred in the beginning of the 2nd century AD, the astronomer would take the Petavius textbook and see what emperor's reign coincided with the date of the eclipse that he had calculated. For instance, Scaligerian chronology would claim that some ruler died that year. The edited chronicle would then become altered to include some phrase like, "the moon or sun darkened upon his demise." The examples of medieval calculations that were claimed, quote, ancient observations, a posteriori, are given in abundance by the modern astronomer Robert Newton in his well-known work entitled The Crime of Claudius Ptolemy. Point 4. The appearances of certain comets may have been calculated into the past. Late medieval scientists, starting with Tycho Brahe and Kepler, were already able to calculate their recurrence periods based on trustworthy observations. The Galley comet may serve as an example. Then the alleged dates of comet appearances were calculated by the extension of several recurrent periods into the past. After the erroneous Petavius textbook was used for reference, and the edited chronicles were altered to contain such phrases as, "in the nth year of reign of Emperor such and such, a comet with a fuzzy tail adorned the sky." Nowadays, we are being convinced that the ancient astronomers really observed all of these appearances of the Galley comet in times immemorial. Moreover, these observations are nowadays presented as proof of the Scaliger-Petavius history textbook. This is not the case in reality. We shall cover comet datings in general and the Galley comet in particular in the chapters of Chronicle 5 that deal with the history of China. In the 19th through 20th century, even some of the professional astronomers were taken in, thinking that they dealt with true ancient observational material, which has led to the construction of theories that should have made the calculated trajectory of the Galilee comet's movement more precise. However, such reconstructions invariably lead to the distortion of the very mathematical theory of the comet's movement, since certain constants in motion equations have to be obtained from empirical observations. If such observations are incorrect or simply fictitious, the constant values also turn out wrong. One sees just how serious the consequences for the history of science may prove, ones that arise from the late medieval chronological calculations that were slyly presented as, in quotes, true astronomical observations later on. These considerations are primarily valid for written sources. It must have been easy enough to take a quill and write the ancient observation down on the page of the Chronicle. Such suspicions are less applicable to trustworthy archaeological findings or the ancient monumental architecture, although great caution is required there as well. However, if a horoscope is presented as a large bas-relief on the ceiling of an old cathedral, or on a coffin in an old sepulchre, one has reason to believe that we see the result of a veracious astronomic observation and not a later calculation based on Scaliger-Petavius chronology. Okay, that is all I'm going to have time for today. We will pick up next time at the beginning of section 5. And I meant to mention this at the beginning, but I'll do it now. Just a reminder that it is simply my current workload at what I do to support my family and make a living that has disallowed me to make more of these videos of the readings of history, fiction, or science than I'd like to. If I had it my way, I would do a reading a day until the book was covered. But it's not all up to me. And much of my spare time, my extra time, my free time, when I'm not scratching out a living like so many others under the burden of evil taxation and usury, I'm spending my time with looking into not only language pursuits concerning the original Hebrew language, but also geography. And I warn you right now that the geographical studies I'm doing are going to produce results that are eye-opening. They have been thus far. I would like to suggest to everyone to take the time to go to the Ashraf Ezzat channel if you have not been. That is ASHRAFEZZAT. I have a trailer for his book, Egypt Knew No Pharaohs Nor Israelites, up right now. And as I have mentioned in the past, unfortunately it seems like my only allies in this pursuit have been either atheists or oftentimes Muslims. Now, it does not seem that Ashraf Ezzat is coming at this from a Muslim perspective, because remember, when Muslims come at this, they still have a narrative from the Quran that they are trying to protect. So we're not going to necessarily get something that is entirely unbiased. They will have biases that they are very much trying to keep intact and sacred. Whereas others who are looking at this purely intellectually, from is there evidence or not, are going to have a very different view. One thing that Azat points out is that there is a total lack of any kind of evidence out in the Sinai Peninsula, northern Saudi Arabia, which would be southern Jordan, and southern Palestine, which would be the Negev desert, that would show that Israel or any company of people that size, and it was a huge company of people, 2 to 3 million people it would have to be. There's no evidence that they were ever there. Now, guys like Azat and others who are coming at this more from an atheistic point of view, or let's just say coming from a point of view that does not believe that the Bible is accurate, are going to look at this and chalk it up as these events never occurred. I, on the other hand, do believe those events occurred. We're just looking in the wrong place. They occurred elsewhere. So, Azat has on his channel, for one thing, playlists. And you can find a playlist of 4 videos, about 15 minutes in length each, entitled Egypt Knew No Pharaohs Nor Israelites. And they are very fascinating, very eye-opening. So please give those a look. And I will see you next time. Take care.